What's the Shroud of Turin?
The Shroud of Turin is believed to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a very unique artifact because we get in this singular artifact the death, burial, and resurrection of the historical Jesus.
The Shroud of Turin has long been one of the most mysterious relics in human history. A simple piece of linen, yet bearing the faint image of a man believed by millions to be Jesus Christ after the crucifixion. For centuries, it has divided the world. To believers, it is sacred, a silent witness to resurrection, a physical trace of the divine. To skeptics, it is nothing more than an elaborate medieval illusion, a masterpiece of deception crafted to inspire faith or exploit it. But now, something new has emerged, something no one expected. Hidden within the fibers of the shroud, a second layer. And it wasn't discovered in a modern lab, it was uncovered by Ethiopian monks. Before we go any further, take a moment to support the channel. A like and subscription truly helps us continue uncovering stories like this. Thank you. For decades, scientists have studied the shroud using every tool available. X-rays, spectroscopy, DNA sequencing, high-energy imaging. They treated it not as a relic, but as evidence, a crime scene frozen in time, every fiber examined, every stain analyzed, every particle cataloged. And yet, despite all this technology, the most disturbing discovery didn't come from Europe. It came from Africa, from a remote monastery in the highlands of Ethiopia, a place where ancient Christian traditions have survived almost untouched for centuries, a place where the outside world rarely reaches, and where the concept of time moves differently, not in a poetic sense, in a practical one, because the monks who live there don't measure history the way the modern world does. They don't divide knowledge into ancient and current. They don't separate what is known from what is believed. For them, the two have always lived together. And that combination, that refusal to separate faith from observation, is precisely what allowed them to see what no scientist had seen before. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand what Ethiopia means in the history of Christianity. This isn't a footnote tradition. This isn't a peripheral branch. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth. Its roots reach back to the 4th century, before Rome formally adopted Christianity as a state religion, before the Council of Nicaea reshaped Western theology, before the Great Schism split the church in two. Ethiopian Christianity developed in parallel with the earliest traditions, drawing directly from Jewish scripture, from Coptic Egypt, from the ancient Semitic world. And it kept things the West discarded. Books that didn't make the canonical cut in Rome or Constantinople survived in Ethiopia. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. Scriptures considered too old, too strange, or too dangerous for mainstream doctrine. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon contains 81 books. The Catholic canon contains 73. The Protestant Bible contains 66. What Ethiopia preserved, everyone else chose to leave behind. And this matters for the Shroud, because the monks who made this discovery weren't operating from ignorance. They were operating from a different kind of knowledge, one that treats sacred objects not as static artifacts, but as living documents, capable of revealing more over time. In the Western academic tradition, an artifact is studied until it yields its information. You apply the tools, you record the results, you publish the findings, and then, at some point, you declare the object understood, or at least as understood as it's going to get. That's not how it works in the Ethiopian monastic world. There, an object is never fully understood. It is only ever partially read, because the belief is that a sacred object reveals itself in stages, not all at once, not on demand, but according to its own logic, its own timing. The monks who live in these highland monasteries have spent generations developing the patience that requires. They don't approach a relic hoping to extract its secrets quickly. They approach it prepared to wait, for years, for decades, for as long as it takes. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the object responds. The monks who live there are not scientists in the modern sense, but they are guardians of something older. knowledge passed down through generations, rituals, texts, and methods of preservation that date back to the earliest days of Christianity. Among them exists a tradition rarely spoken of outside their community, a belief that sacred relics are not what they appear on the surface, that they contain layers, physical and spiritual. This idea that a sacred object holds more than its surface shows is not unique to Ethiopia, but nowhere else has it been maintained as a continuous, unbroken practice for as long. These monks have spent centuries developing methods for reading objects, not analyzing them in the Western scientific sense, reading them the way a scholar reads a manuscript, layer by layer, context by context. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition is one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. Scholars here were preserving, copying, and layering texts at a time when much of Europe's written heritage was being lost to war and fire. They developed techniques for recovering overwritten documents, for reading beneath the visible layer, for identifying what had been erased, covered, or hidden, not by malice, but simply by time. Those techniques didn't stay confined to manuscripts. Over centuries they migrated, from paper to parchment, from parchment to fabric, from fabric to any material that could hold a mark. And it was that tradition, that specific way of approaching a physical object, that made the difference. According to accounts that only recently reached the outside world, a small fragment, believed to be connected to the Shroud of Turin, was brought to the monastery decades ago. Not for display, not for study, but for protection. The monks claimed it carried something unfinished, something hidden. The idea that a relic could be unfinished needs a moment. In Western scholarship, an artifact either reveals its information or it doesn't. You apply enough technology, and eventually the object gives up what it knows. But in the Ethiopian monastic tradition, an object can carry information that isn't ready to be seen. Not hidden deliberately, not encrypted, simply waiting for the right conditions, the right moment, the right eyes. That's what they believed the fragment was carrying. And so they waited. They kept it sealed. They kept it protected. They kept it wrapped in cloth that had itself been treated, with oils, with incense residue, with materials whose exact composition is not known outside the monastery walls. They prayed over it. They watched it. They gave it time. For years, nothing happened. The fragment remained sealed, untouched, wrapped in layers of cloth and prayer. Until one night, during a ritual of illumination, a practice involving candlelight, heat, and incense, the monks noticed something unusual. The surface of the cloth began to change, not burn, not degrade, but reveal. Beneath the faint, familiar image, another pattern began to emerge. At first, it looked like discoloration, then shapes, then something far more precise. A second image. The monks did not panic. They did not rush to document it. They did not immediately reach for outside help, because this was not, to them, entirely unexpected. They had believed something was there. They had waited for it to appear. And now, after years of patience, of ritual, of preservation, it was showing itself. They watched it carefully. They recorded what they saw in the way their tradition demands, not through photography or measurement, but through description. Detailed, precise, layered description, written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, a language that has been used continuously for over 2,000 years. Unlike the outer layer, which appears soft and photographic, this hidden layer was sharp, harsh, detailed in a way that felt almost anatomical. The monks described it as the truth beneath the suffering. That phrase stayed with the researchers who later heard it, because it implied something the monks couldn't have known from modern science. It implied depth, not metaphorical depth, physical depth. The idea that the cloth wasn't carrying one record, but two, one on the surface, one underneath, both formed in the same moment, both present for centuries, one seen, one waiting. Word of the discovery eventually reached researchers. Carefully, quietly, samples were analyzed, and what they found aligned with the monks' claims. There was, in fact, a second structural layer embedded within the linen fibers, not added later, not painted, but formed simultaneously, yet hidden. To understand why this is so significant, you need to understand what the first layer already defies. The visible image on the shroud is one of the most analyzed surfaces in scientific history. STURP, the Shroud of Turin research project, spent 5 days in direct contact with the cloth in 1978. 24 researchers, multiple institutions, equipment that filled transport cases. Their conclusion after years of analysis: the image is not the result of any pigment, dye, or stain. No artist's medium has been detected. The discoloration affects only the outermost fibers, a fraction of a micron deep. The mechanism of image formation remains unknown. That was 1981, and it has not been overturned. Every attempt to replicate the image has succeeded in one dimension and failed in others. Scorch the cloth, you get depth penetration that the shroud doesn't have. Apply acid, you get chemical traces that the shroud doesn't have. Use radiation, you get surface effects that partially match, but nothing that reproduces the full picture. The first image alone is unexplained. Now there were two. And here's the detail that makes the second layer stranger than the first. The visible image, strange as it is, behaves in a way that science can at least describe. It has a spectral signature. It responds to light in measurable ways. It can be photographed, mapped, and analyzed, even if it cannot be explained. The second layer is different. This layer behaved differently under light. While the known image reacts like a photographic negative, this hidden imprint responded only to specific wavelengths, particularly in the ultraviolet and infrared spectrum. It was invisible to the naked eye, invisible to early photography, even invisible to many modern scans. This detail matters more than it might seem, because it means the second layer wasn't hiding. It wasn't concealed. It was simply outside the range of every instrument used to examine the shroud, until the monks, using heat and light in a specific combination during their ritual, accidentally created the conditions needed to see it. Not through advanced technology, through ancient practice. There is something deeply uncomfortable about that, because it means that for all the decades of scientific examination, for all the spectrometers and X-ray machines and DNA sequencers, the key to unlocking the shroud's second layer was candlelight and incense, and a tradition that is over 1,000 years old. And then came the disturbing part. The second image did not simply replicate the first, it revealed more. Where the outer image shows wounds, the inner layer shows depth, tissue trauma, patterns consistent with extreme physical stress. Microscopic mapping suggested not just surface injuries, but internal damage, as if the cloth had recorded something beyond skin level. This distinction is critical. The surface image, the one the world has studied, shows what you would expect from contact. A body, wounds, the aftermath of violence. But the inner layer doesn't show aftermath. It shows process. The difference between a photograph of damage and a map of how damage occurred. One records the result. The other records the event. Think about what that means forensically. A photograph of a crime scene tells you what happened. A forensic reconstruction tells you how. These are fundamentally different kinds of information. One is passive. One is active. One captures a moment. One captures a sequence. The surface image of the shroud has always been understood as passive, a record of a body at rest. The inner layer, if the interpretation holds, is something else entirely. A record of a body in the middle of something, not after, during. Scientists began to compare the findings with known forensic data. What they saw was unsettling. The hidden layer aligned with conditions seen in severe trauma cases: massive muscle breakdown, extreme dehydration, signs consistent with hypovolemic shock. But there was something else: energy. Just like the visible image, this inner layer showed signs of having been formed by an intense burst of radiation, but unlike the outer imprint, which sits on the surface of the fibers, this one penetrated deeper, as if it originated from within the body itself. Let that sit for a moment. The visible image, the one that's baffled science for a century, appears to have been formed by energy radiating outward from the body. That alone has no scientific explanation. But the second layer suggests something more specific. It's not just energy moving outward. Energy moving through the surface layer, through the fibers, through the depth of the cloth itself, as if whatever caused it didn't just interact with the surface of the linen. It passed through it. In physics, very few things pass cleanly through a material without either being absorbed by it or destroying it. High energy gamma radiation can penetrate fabric, but it leaves traces. It damages the molecular structure. It changes the material in ways that are measurable and obvious. The inner layer shows none of that damage. The cloth is intact. The fibers are not destroyed. The structure is not compromised. And yet something passed through it. Something that left a mark without leaving destruction. Something that encoded information without disturbing the medium it passed through. Modern physics has no framework for that. Not because physicists haven't tried to find one, but because nothing in the known catalog of physical phenomena produces that combination of effects. Penetration without damage, encoding without contact, information without a visible mechanism.
They looked like the perfect match. Nicole Kidman.
Now there were two, one external, one internal, both created in the same instant. The monks had one interpretation. They believed the outer image showed what the world saw, the suffering, the wounds. But the inner layer, that was something else, a record of transformation. They weren't using scientific language. They weren't talking about radiation or fiber depth or spectral response. They were talking about what they believed happened inside that cloth. Not the moment before, not the moment after. The moment of change itself. Frozen in linen, invisible for centuries. Back in the laboratories, researchers reached a different conclusion. Or rather, they failed to reach one. Because nothing in known science could fully explain how two distinct images, formed by energy, could exist in different depths of the same fabric without destroying it. Even more puzzling, the second layer appeared more precise, more controlled, as if it followed a different set of rules entirely. The surface image has anomalies, areas of variation, regions where the intensity shifts unexpectedly. The inner layer didn't have those same anomalies. It was more consistent, more uniform, as if it had been formed by a process that was, for lack of a better word, deliberate. That word is dangerous in a scientific context. Deliberate implies intent, and intent implies agency. And agency, in this context, implies something that science is not equipped to evaluate, which is exactly why researchers kept returning to the data rather than the interpretation. Because the data was already strange enough. And then came the final anomaly, DNA traces. Previous studies had already revealed that the shroud contains genetic material from multiple regions of the world. Europe, the Middle East, Africa, even Asia, a record of every hand that touched it, every room it rested in, every century it survived. But when scientists isolated samples specifically from the deeper layer, they found something different. The genetic signals were weaker, older, less contaminated, and they pointed overwhelmingly to one region, the Middle East. This suggested something extraordinary, that the deeper layer had remained protected, sealed away from centuries of handling, untouched by pilgrims, untouched by history. A hidden archive, preserved for nearly 2,000 years. Think about what that means. The surface of the shroud is a palimpsest of human history. Thousands of hands, hundreds of locations, decades of scientific contact. All of it written on top of the original. But beneath all of that, deeper than the contamination, deeper than the pilgrimages and the fires and the folding and the tests, something original remained, untouched, unread, until now. And here is where the two threads, the scientific and the monastic, converge in a way that is difficult to dismiss. The monks believed the fragment carried something original, something that had not yet been reached by the world, something sealed beneath everything the world had added to it. And the DNA analysis, conducted independently with no connection to the monastery, found exactly that. An original signal, beneath the noise, pointing to the place where the story began. So now, the Shroud of Turin is no longer just a single mystery. It is two: an outer image the world has debated for centuries, and an inner one, only now coming into focus. One visible and one hidden, one understood, at least partially, the other still beyond explanation. And the implications of that split are enormous. Because every argument about the Shroud, every theory, every study, every debate has been conducted about the surface layer. The forgery argument is about the surface. The carbon dating is from the surface. The STIRP analysis focused on the surface. The VP8 three-dimensional encoding came from the surface. Every conclusion on every side was drawn from one half of the data. And nobody knew the other half existed. So now every argument has to be reopened. The forgery theory has to explain not one impossible image, but two. Two layers. Two different spectral signatures. Two different energy profiles. A medieval artist who could forge one image that has defied scientific replication for 50 years. Could they forge a second one that's invisible to the naked eye? That only responds to specific wavelengths? That shows internal trauma, a detail with forensic precision? That contains DNA signals pointing to the ancient Middle East, sealed beneath centuries of contamination. Each of those questions alone is difficult. Together, they become something else. The authenticity arguments face a different challenge. The resurrection hypothesis. The idea that the image was formed by a burst of energy during a moment of physical transformation now has to account for two separate energy signatures. Not one burst, two, or one burst that behave differently at different depths, which in some ways is an even stranger claim, because that's not how any known form of energy works. Energy doesn't politely produce two different images at two different depths of the same cloth, while leaving the cloth itself structurally intact. Nothing does that. Nothing we know of. And that phrase, nothing we know of, is where both sides of the debate now find themselves standing. NCST, together, for the first time. The Ethiopian monks never claimed to solve the mystery, they simply revealed it. And there's something in that worth holding, because for all the centuries of argument, all the scientific teams, all the institutional debates, all the carbon samples and spectral analyses, it was a group of monks in a highland monastery, using candlelight and incense, who found what nobody else found. Not because they had better technology, but because they were looking differently. They weren't trying to solve the image. They were trying to read the object. And that distinction, that single shift in approach, changed everything. Now the question remains, if the first image challenges everything we know about history, what does the second one mean? Is it evidence of something science has yet to understand? A phenomenon beyond physics, or proof that the Shroud is not just a relic of death, but of something that came after? Consider what it would mean if the inner layer is real, if it holds, if it survives the scrutiny that will come. It would mean the Shroud has been carrying two records, simultaneously, for nearly 2,000 years. One for the world, one waiting, and the fact that it took this long to notice too says something. Not about the Shroud, about us, about what we chose to look for, about what questions we thought to ask, about what framework we brought to the object, and what framework we left at the door. The monks brought a different framework, one built over centuries of reading sacred objects, one that assumed there was always more than the surface showed. And they were right, which raises a question that cuts across the entire debate. How many other things are we studying that we're only seeing half of? How many artifacts, documents, and relics contain layers we haven't found because we haven't thought to look below the surface? How many answers are sitting there, waiting for someone to approach the question differently? The history of discovery is full of moments like this. Sin soul. moments where the answer wasn't hidden. It was simply invisible to the framework being used to look for it. Troy was considered mythology until someone dug for it. The Dead Sea Scrolls sat in caves for 2,000 years until a shepherd threw a stone. The Antikythera mechanism corroded on the seafloor for a century before anyone understood what they were looking at. In every case, the object was there. The information was present. What was missing was the right question. And now, with the Shroud, the right question may finally have been asked. Not by a laboratory, not by a university, not by a government-funded research program, by monks in a monastery in the Ethiopian highlands, using a practice so old that its origins are not fully documented. The Shroud of Turin has survived fire. It has survived war. It has survived centuries of handling and decades of scientific examination. And now it has survived the assumption that it had given up all its secrets. Because it hadn't. The outer image is the mystery the world argued about. The inner layer is the mystery the world didn't know existed. And whatever comes next, whatever studies are conducted, whatever findings emerge, whatever conclusions are eventually drawn, the Shroud is no longer a single question. It never was. We just didn't know what we were holding. One cloth, two records. One visible since the beginning, one hidden until now. And the space between them, that invisible gap between surface and depth, may be where the real answer lives. Not proven, not explained. But finally, for the first time in 2,000 years, noticed? Because that is how the deepest truths tend to survive. Not by being loud, not by demanding attention, but by waiting. Patient, silent, encoded in the material, until someone, somewhere, stops looking at the surface and looks beneath it.